Hello and welcome again to another episode. Here we are on it's a beautiful Sunday morning. And let's see, today is the 10th of August of 2025. And so wanted to record this little episode here before I got going on here with some daily chores here. Got to cut the grass and do some stuff around the house, and had planned to make some pretty delicious barbacoa. Now, traditionally, barbacoa, it's more where you use cheek meat, like beef cheek meat, and then you cook it like on the ground, pit roast almost style. But there's a really good way you can make it, though, just like in the slow cooker with using chuck steak, and it comes out pretty good. I mean, it's almost pretty comparable. So a lot easier to do. The meat is not quite as fatty. And so yeah, kind of excited to get that going here later on, so we can maybe have it for dinner tonight if I can get it in the slow cooker in time. But yeah, that's a little bit of what my Sunday looks like. And so to start off, this is my first major episode where I feel like I have a bit of a structure to it. So I'm kind of excited to get this going here. And so basically, I think the way I'm going to do my podcast episodes, I am thinking of doing it once a week. And I might add something else like a complimentary podcast on the side later. And so I have a bit of a structure to it. So I'll kind of give a breakdown here of what I'm looking at. One thing that I've been doing is kind of experimenting with is doing a little game, which I've been calling Roulette of Gaming. I don't know if I might stick with that and all, but what it is that I've been keeping track of just a bunch of video games that I either want to own, or want to play. And so far the list, I think I got like about 1,255 games on this list or so. And so so every now and then, if I'm a little at loss, like what to play, I have a number generator app on my phone that I'll just, put in like 1 through 1,255, for example, and just let it generate a number. And then I'll just pick a game from that list there. And so what I thought would be kind of fun to do in that, with that there, is I'll pick 3 games that way, and then I'll just talk about them for whatever my knowledge is of them. Or if it's something that if it's a game that am not too familiar with, then I'll talk still as much as I know about the game, and then maybe add it as a game to play for that week, or games to play for that week, and then in the next episode I'll give some thoughts on it. So that'll be the first little part here of this podcast. And then after that, I just want to touch base on a little bit about something that has to do with more modernish gaming. So whether if it's a game that I'm playing, that I'm interested in playing, that I'm looking forward to, or something in the news that happened, and I'm trying to put a bit of a positive spin on it. And just because there's a lot going on with the video game industry right now that I personally also am not, too super thrilled about, but I also think that there's a lot of good stuff out there as well too. And so that's what I want to try to bring light to and all. And so we can still, just to have a bit of information out there that can still help us keep invested in this hobby, and, that there are still good stuff coming out there, because there's a lot of people out there putting a lot of good work in things, for whether if it's just something going on again in the video game industry or games themselves. And so I want to try to bring a little bit of light into those. As I don't want to do like a modern gaming news or anything like that. That's a little bit too much work for me to try to keep up with, but just something that's fairly recently, right? And when I say fairly, it could be something within the past, 3 to 5 years or so, right? And all, but I'll try to keep it more within the modern times and all. So you'll kind of see here what I'm going to talk about in today's episode. And then after that, I have just sort of like the main bulk of what I wanted to talk about in the episode. And so what I'm going to start off doing is I just figured it'd be a fun way for me to sort of keep track of video game history, and for myself and all, and then also just to provide the information out there for anybody that wants to listen, is I'll be going through the years in gaming from the year that I was born. And so in 1980, and so video games started before that. I want to say Pong, I guess you can say like the first official, market relevant video game was, back in 1972, I think. And then we had the 70s and all, which, Atari was a big factor in there, and the arcade scene and all started in that era. But I wanted to pick 1980 just because it's the year that I was born. And obviously, I didn't know anything about video games at the time because I was a small little blob. But it's just where I've been able to go back to, and I still have a decent enough frame of reference of what happened and all, when we start getting into the 70s and all, it's just kind of a very gray area that I don't have a whole lot of insight on, and so that's why I figured I started with 1980. And so each episode I'm going to give some information on just what happened with video games that year. I'll try to see if I can come up with like what were the top selling games of that year, or just maybe major events that happened. And so for the first several years, because again I was too small to really understand anything, I'm going to be using Wikipedia a lot, so just so I can have some sort of structure to some of the events and things that happen as the years start going on. And if I have when I know that I'm a bit more familiar with the actual events as I live them, I'll be giving my insight as well too also. And maybe some of the stuff I won't even use too much, like online information. I'll still probably be doing it for like, looking up, what were the top selling games and all that. But I'll be giving my own personal spin too also, since, for the years that I started having more of a personal experience. But anyways, to get it going here, let's start off with, again, the little game here of Roulette of Gaming. And so I have these games in alphabetical order. Again, I got my list here of just games that I've been keeping track of. Let's see. And yeah, so I'm up to 1,255. So I just go into my random generator app here. And let's see. So we're going to start off with the very first game. And so let's click on the randomize button. So it's giving me 965. So let's see what game that is. And that is Street Fighter 2. The OG Street Fighter 2. All right. Okay, let's pick another one. 1,240. Let's see. Yakuza Like a Dragon. Okay. And for the third one, 719. And that is Pandemonium 2. All right, interesting little selection here. And so let's talk a little bit about Street Fighter 2. So this is the original one, so not the Hyper Edition or the Championship Edition or Super Street Fighter 2. This is just the old school Street Fighter 2. And so for this game, it was huge in the arcades. I remember just people being just crowding around one of the arcade cabinets and all, and you can hear the booming sound effects coming from there, and the just the sounds of the punches and all, and the Hadoukens coming out. It was just always, it just seemed like that arcade cabinet was just always kind of loud with the, music and the sound effects coming out. And yeah, it was just a fun thing to try to learn these combinations and all. And see, I come from a time still where I remember where the original Street Fighter was fairly big in the arcade, and that one there, if I remember right, it had almost like a big button that you could press to try to pull it, and then with the joystick to try to pull off move. And I just remember people pounding on that button a lot. And if you've ever played the original Street Fighter, that game it's very, very clunky. It's the way you pull off the moves. It almost seems like a stroke of luck, and it's honestly, it hasn't aged the best, and it's not that fun. Back then, I remember thinking that it was a cool looking arcade game and all, and I always thought that it was just you have to be really skilled and all to pull off these moves and all. And while part of that is true, I mean, what I've played of it, it really is just kind of, you just have to keep pushing the buttons and rotating the analogs or your joystick or your D-pad or whatever to pull off these moves. And I don't know, the game mechanics of it just aren't very polished. But Street Fighter 2, what I remember when I first started playing it, in the arcades. And once I started learning some of the moves, doing the quarter circle, the half circle, or charge back for 2 seconds and forward, and then push a attack button and all, that's the first time where I really felt that in a fighting game that as long as I know the combination of the moves, the game was pretty accurate in following up with whatever I was trying to make it do. And so once I got the hang of it, and it's like, okay, so a quarter circle, as long as I don't mess it up, it's gonna, do a certain move. And then after that, your brain just starts, operating in a way like, okay, so if I do this move and then I do this attack and this attack, I think I can strategize some kind of a way to be competitive in it. And that was the hook, I think, to Street Fighter 2, at least for me personally, where it started feeling that you progressed in the game or you won because of your skill, right? Because the game was doing what you wanted it to do as long as you were doing the commands correctly. And that became very addicting for me, and I'm sure for a lot of different people. And what made Street Fighter 2 stand out from the crowd out of a lot of the, not only the fighting games that were out at the time, but the ones that kept up, that followed up. So like shortly after Street Fighter 2, we got just like a huge wave of fighting games that were coming out. And a lot of them were really great in their own right, like Mortal Kombat, a lot of the Neo Geo fighting games. A lot of them were great. But for me personally, nothing felt as precise, as technical, and as rewarding for your skill outside of than this game, Street Fighter 2. And it just laid a foundation that was just golden and continued on for many, many years and still ongoing to this day, with the newest release, Street Fighter 6. And it started with this one here. And, and then you get the colorful cast of characters that, are, from the World Warriors, right? That are all over the world and all have their own personalities and look and all that. And I thought it was great. And you just, spawned a legendary franchise from there. And Street Fighter, series, going forward from here on out is definitely one of it's my favorite fighting game series of all time. And specifically some of the specific entries in this series. But this is where it started. And it was a big deal. And it was a big deal too also when it came out for home, starting with the Super Nintendo version, which I want to say that one came out in 1992. And it was like one of the first big blockbuster hits that the Super Nintendo had, and from a third party also, because the Super Nintendo kind of became the go-to system for not only Nintendo games, but also just a lot of third party games that were coming out that were really popular because Nintendo was the bigger name, so everybody wanted their games on the Nintendo system, like third-party developers, and then also it had some power to back it up too. Where, like for example, the Street Fighter 2 Home Edition, yeah, the sprites look smaller, some things aren't quite as detailed and missing some animation, but it was a very, very faithful adaptation of the arcade version. And so that was pretty cool that we got to, that the Super Nintendo was able to get that version there. Then the Sega Genesis got their Championship Edition, which was really, really well done as well too. And in some ways, I like it better than the Super Nintendo one. And then, then they got the Hyper Edition on the Super Nintendo. And then they both got the Super Street Fighter 2 version. And then again, all these different variations that that Street Fighter ended up coming out with. But yeah, great fighting series. And, still ongoing to this day with Street Fighter 6. But yeah, that's what I got on Street Fighter 2. And so the next one up is Yakuza Like a Dragon. So with the Yakuza games, I'm not going to have a whole lot to say on this one just because I don't really know this franchise that well. I've messed around a little bit with Yakuza Kiwami, the first one, and that's about to the extent of it. And it's one of those series that it's in my backlog of games that I know everyone really talks really great about these games and all that, but it just got to the point where there's so many of them now. And if I never started a series from some time ago and there's like just a bunch of entries in there, it's a little intimidating to say like, oh gosh, where do I even start? And from my understanding of these Yakuza games, they can be kind of like their own standalones is what I understand. But it's a series that I've really been interested in. There seems to be a lot about these series that I feel like I would get enjoyment from. I just haven't gotten the time to really put some time into them. And Yakuza Like a Dragon, that's the one where I believe it went to turn-based RP, like a turn-based RPG, right? And so, yeah, it has my interest in it. I had a buddy of mine that was telling me that how great the series is, and so maybe this will give me the little push to give it a try. The only thing is though that I don't think it's on Game Pass anymore. So if it's available somewhere for either super cheap or on Game Pass, I don't think it's on there though. But I'll give it a shot this week. But if not, it might just have to wait a bit because I'm not in a position where I want to purchase it, especially like at a full price. But yeah, I mean, I definitely want to check it out. It seems like a very the games just seem like a lot of fun where it has a cool story to them and all, but they also have a lot of silliness to them and it all blends it all together really in a cool way. And it's just amazing how many Yakuza games Sega keeps outputting on these. So I'm definitely, it's one of the series that I really need to get into because it feels like I'd have a lot of fun with it, but just haven't to recently. But yeah, maybe I'll have more to say on it here in the next coming episode if I can find it somewhere to play. And for the third one, Pandemonium 2. So this is not a very popular game. So for anybody that doesn't know, so it's Pandemonium 2, which is obviously the sequel, to Pandemonium. And Pandemonium is the one that I have a bit of experience with. It was a platformer that came out back in the day on the PlayStation. It was a pretty early release, so I want to say I think it came out maybe 1995, 96 maybe on the PlayStation. And it was developed by Crystal Dynamics. And Crystal Dynamics was just outputting a bunch of games during this time frame when the fifth generation hit, starting with the 3DO. So they had like Crash and Burn, Total Eclipse, and then Off-World Interceptor. I believe it was like you're driving like a truck in some kind of like alien terrain, I believe. And they were just outputting a bunch of games, right? I think they even have like sports games and all that. And so then when the PlayStation and the Saturn came out, they just started throwing a bunch of games on there as well too, like Gex, and they had a bunch of games, The Horde, I believe, and also Pandemonium. And so Pandemonium, like I said, I played a bit of the first one on the PlayStation, and you play as a girl and also a jester. And honestly, I forgot what the story is about, but what was unique about this game, at least at the time, was that it was kind of the start of like what was kind of starting to be considered a 2.5D platformer. And what that is, it's that it's a platforming game, like a side-scrolling platforming game, like we were already used to in the fourth and third generations, where, you're moving from left to right, and you can, kind of go back and forth. Only the backgrounds are in 3D. And so as you're moving your character, it gives you like a lot of cool camera angles where, it makes everything look very cinematic and all. And it was really cool to see at the time. But in reality, you're still technically moving left to right. So it was a cool concept. And I liked that. There was a lot of 2.5D platformers that I really enjoyed back in the day. And I just thought they were really visually pleasing to look at. And Pandemonium was one of the more better looking ones and playing ones at the time too. And I've gotten a little ways into the one on the PlayStation, and also came out on the Sega Saturn afterwards, which was a comparable port. They did a decent job on the Saturn one, but the PlayStation one is the one that's better, optimized. But part 2, I haven't played that one, and that one only came out on the PlayStation. And if it's anything like part 1, they're fun platformers. They're, what I recall, they have kind of silly stories and all, but they're pretty fun though. And like I said, visually they were pretty appealing too. And from what I recall, I think part 2 was pretty impressive, with its graphics back on the PlayStation. So yeah, I'd be curious to check out that game too. So 2 games that I am not too familiar with, and one that I'm very familiar with. So I think for this week, I'm going to see if I can play a bit of Yakuza Like a Dragon and Pandemonium 2. They sound like two games that they're in my backlog, this list that I'm going off of. And so it'll be at least fun just to at least play them a little bit and, see if I can provide some information on them for the next episode. But that's it for Role of Gaming. And so as far as for modern, any modern gaming tip news or anything, well, I think right now, so a few things that I'm excited about for like modern gaming stuff is I just bought Black Myth Wukong, and so that's a game that I've been interested in playing. Um, from what it seems like, it's like a Souls-like game, but it doesn't seem to be completely hard like a Souls-like game, and so meaning that I might have a chance to get somewhat far in it. I like Souls-like games. I like the concept of them, especially like the Dark Souls games specifically, or like Elden Ring and all. It's just, I have a hard time getting through those games. It's like my brain just has a hard time wrapping my mind around how to move, proceed in those games. So I did somewhat recently was trying to go through Elden Ring, and I was using a walkthrough on YouTube, and so they're kind of explaining like just how the best ways to level up and things like that, just to get me going. It's like, okay, how do like, I get a lot of the games are sort of very vague as far as what your objectives are and how you level up and all that. But I was like, I just need a bit of a visual guide to, help me through this. Cause it's one of those series that I suck at them, but I like the concept of them. And it's like, I want to enjoy these games. So I'm not giving up on them yet. I want to try to, really give it some time. And so maybe with Black Myth Wukong, which seems to be a bit of a lesser Dark Souls, but still a really cool game. Maybe this is the one that's going to really hook me on that style of game, and then eventually I can go through the Dark Souls games and Elden Ring and all that. But we'll see. But yeah, kind of excited to check it out. And then the next one that I want to talk about here is for Ninja Gaiden Ragebound. And so this is a new game that has come out fairly recently. It's let's see. But yeah, it's been a pretty fun game, and I've gone like up to 4 levels now in it, and it's cool, it's fun, it does play differently than the old school 2D Ninja Gaiden games where, I don't know, it just has a bit, it feels more like more recent indie games than an old school Ninja Gaiden game, which is not a bad thing by no means. And it's developed by the people that made the Blasphemous 1 and 2 indie title. I played a little bit of Blasphemous and all. It seems cool and all, but I'm not too familiar with them. But with Ninja Gaiden Ragebound, it's a very fast-paced game, and it is a lot of fun. It's not quite as well. I mean, I got to this boss that it is difficult, so never mind. I was gonna say it's not quite as difficult as the original Ninja Gaiden, but I was getting my butt kicked on that boss, so maybe I shouldn't say that. But I was playing it, and it definitely has that feel of like, okay, as long as I learn the patterns, I can beat this, and then you just got to get really, good as far as your skills with dodging and shooting and all that. The boss that I was fighting, I was using some shurikens from one of the, or kunais, I believe they're called, with one of like the secondary character you can play in it. But otherwise, the main character you play in it, it's more where he uses his sword for melee attacks. But you just have some cool moves, like you have a jump that if you press twice, you almost turn into like a spinning, slashing guillotine circle. And that's kind of cool how you can maneuver through the stages like that and all. And so the music is excellent too. And the 2D art is really great as well too. The only thing that I kind of, it's a bit of a nuisance is that, like a lot of modern games nowadays, and I think the reason why games are done this way is just because to try to pad things out so they don't seem as short. Because a lot of old school games like platformers like this, we're fairly short. Is that sometimes the levels feel a little drawn out. And for me, like a really good 2D action game and all that, if it, is that where it's just more shorter levels, where everything isn't so padded out. And I feel it just sometimes drags out for a little bit too long. And I mean, like I said, in this one, the combat is really fun and all, but for me, it's just, after a while, it's like, okay, let's kind of wrap up this stage, and all. But and again, that it maybe it's not so bad as I keep going through the game, but that was just one thing that I did kind of notice. But other than that, though, I mean, it is an excellent game, and definitely if you want like a challenging 2D action game, this is definitely a fun one. And I'm kind of excited actually that this and Shinobi are coming out so close to each other. And so I played the demo of the Shinobi, and that one seems really cool as well too. So, I mean, either way, whatever my nitpicks are, they still seem both like excellent games. But yeah, that's just what I got for now for new kind of more newish game news or information. And so let's get in here to going back in time, back to 1980, on what was going on there in the video game industry. And so 1980, I just looked up some information on it, and there was actually a lot of things that were starting to happen. And because 1980, Atari was kind of at the top as far as at least in the United States, as far as like being the dominant video game company. But there was also a lot of things happening in the arcades too. Like there was, I mean, some of these arcade cabinets were just, money munchers. They were very profitable, and it was just they would take this gameplay loop and just make it really addicting. And so they were pretty difficult too. And so people would just pour in the quarters into these machines. And so just to give a little bit of information here, so with 1980, there was so there was a lot of games that came out, right, that eventually had a lot of influence in the industry. So games like Pac-Man, Battlezone, Crazy Climber, Mystery House, Missile Command, Phoenix, Rally X, Space Panic, Stratovox, Zork, Adventure, and Olympic Decathlon. And so the highest grossing video game was the arcade cabinet game for Namco's Pac-Man. And the best-selling home system was the Nintendo's Game & Watch. I've never had a Game & Watch, and I'm not too familiar with it, but this was the handheld that Nintendo had way before the Game Boy, and it was very simplistic. Like if you ever seen like those Tiger little handhelds it's very basic, very simple. There's not a whole lot to them, but it was pretty revolutionary. I can imagine back then, right, that you can have a bit of a game in a portable. So I mean, portable gaming goes pretty far back there, even back to those times, and the Atari 2600 was starting to get really popular, and with it was starting to get ports, right, from some of these really popular arcade games like Space Invader. And so they weren't quite as good looking at the time, but like when you got them to home, but it was still it was cool that you can play them though. And so let's see, just going over some information here for financial performance with the video game industry. So like the arcade video game market in the US generated 2.81 billion in revenue, or 10.7 billion adjusted for inflation. And so let's see, the home video game sell 464 million, or 1.77 billion adjusted for inflation in the United States, with the Atari VCS, later known as the Atari 2600, was leading the market with a 44% share. So Atari for home was very dominant. There was a lot of other systems that were out, like the ColecoVision, or I don't know if they had already come out at the time, but eventually in the second generation, because the second generation was sort of like a bit of the Wild West of just like a bunch of different companies making their game consoles. Like, eventually the ColecoVision and Television and Magnavox Odyssey 2 and some other ones came out, around this time. But Atari was definitely the one leading the pack, though. And so let's see. So the highest grossing arcade games. So Pac-Man, it was number one. And so it's stating on here that gross revenue was $1 billion adjusted for inflation, 3.8 billion. And then at number two, it just kind of gives three games here with Asteroids, Galaxian, and Space Invaders. And let's see. And then the best-selling home video game systems, let's see. So that was Space Invaders at number one, Breakout at number two, Football at number 3, Bowling at number 4, Night Driver at number 5, Air Sea Battle at number 6, Circus Atari at number 7, Street Racer at number 8, and Video Olympics at number 9. All of these on the Atari system. And then the best-selling home system, so it was actually the Game & Watch from Nintendo, and then the Atari VCS, again later known as the 2600. And then number 3 is TRS-80. I'm not too familiar what that is. Looks like it's some kind of a computer console. And then number 4 was Intellivision. And then number 5 was the Atari 400 or Atari 800. Seems like it was some kind of a computer. And then number 6 was the Commodore PET. And number 7 was the Apple II. And then 8 was the HP 9800, HP Series 80. And number 9 was the North Star Horizon. And then number 10 was a TI 99/4. So a lot of those last ones are some kind of a computer systems. I'm not too familiar with those there. A few events, though, that happened was, looks like Electronic Games hosted the first arcade awards, the first video game award ceremony. And so, let's see, looks like Space Invaders won the Game of the Year. And let's see. So in May of 2000, or May 22nd of 1980, Namco released Pac-Man, originally called Puck-Man in Japan, and it became the highest grossing game of all time, at least I would assume up to that point. And it had the first gaming mascot character, so that was kind of a big deal, right? Where it was like a mascot, right? Where previous video games, they didn't have really like a character, so to speak, right? That you can call it like a mascot. But then in May, Stratovox from Sun Electronics was the first game with voice synthesis. And then in July, Atari released the another really popular arcade game, Missile Command. And then in October, Crazy Climber came out. So it was the first video game with a climbing mechanic and an objective of climbing to the top of the level. And then in November 12th, Stern Electronics releases a game called Berserk with designer Alan McNeil making the game. Or with his signature on the monitor glass of each cabinet. And then in November, Namco releases Rally X, which was the first game with a bonus round. It also featured multi-directional scrolling. And then in November, Universal releases Space Panic. The first game was Platforms and Ladders. The term platform game was still several years in the future. Interesting. And then in November, Atari releases the first-person 3D tank shooter Battlezone. Cinematronics releases Star Castle. And then, let's see, Midway as Wizard of War is released. And then the multi-stage Phoenix sports one of the first video game bosses, a purple alien in a mothership. And let's see. And so then Atari's port of Space Invader becomes the killer app for the VCS and first console title to sell 1 million copies. And the first batch of games from Activision, all for Atari VCS, hit stores. So Activision was the first third-party publisher. And from what I understand, I think there were some employees that had some kind of connection to Atari, and I think they broke out of Atari to form their own company, which later became Activision. And, they just became a juggernaut, in the years to follow. But yeah, they had their first games. So Dragster, Fishing Derby, Boxing, Bridge, and Checkers come out. And so then Nintendo released a Game & Watch series of LCD handheld electronics by Gunpei Yokoi, which he later would become famous for creating the Game Boy, and also, I believe, the main man behind Metroid. Let's see. And so, 1980, a lot of arcade games, right, were becoming really popular during this time. And, again, this is the year that I was born, so obviously I was experiencing video games at that time. But when I've gone back and played some of these games, there were games that were just made for fun, right? Where you're just It has an addictive gameplay loop, and then also was challenging. So like Pac-Man, I can go back to that game still and all and have a lot of fun with it. It's just, it's very difficult, but it just has a very simple concept. You're, trying to get away from these ghosts while munching on these like dots along the way, and just the whole simple nature of trying to get away from them, going through the maze and all, until you can get all the dots and all, was just it was just addicting. And then the high scores too, also, just I can imagine back then, because I lived through a bit of part of it, where it was exciting to see your name on the high score of a public arcade cabinet, right, and all, where that a lot of other people played, and if you can get at least within the top 10 or so, you'd be like, hey, that's my name right there, and also that was cool. And it was it's definitely where the competitive nature of gaming started, I would imagine. And which still lingers on to this day. And yeah, I mean, I just remember a lot of the games, especially the ones that have like the two controllers, and all, you're side by side next to someone, and so you're feeling the heat of each other right enough when you're in the middle of a pretty heated competition. And those were the great days, whether if you were playing competitively or co-op somehow. And it was just it was fun time in the arcades. And the other cool thing too also was just how innovative a lot of these arcade cabinets were, where they had specialized controls depending on what kind of a game it was. So there was a joystick and the buttons, which is the more common one, but then some of them had like a paddle, like a rolling ball kind of paddle thing that you would use. Or some of them had like these very almost like complex like wheels and all, that feels like a racing game. And so it was just, they were video games were very experimental during this time, as I think that with a lot of developers, they were probably just really excited to see what was, what they were able to do with all this new technology that they were having access to. There's a lot of ways to play a lot of these games also. So I know one way that you can buy it at retail, and that has a lot of games that are going back from the 1970s until, let's say up to 1980, is there's the Atari, it's kind of like a compilation of old games. Is it the Atari's 50th anniversary? I don't quite recall, but it's called something like that, which you can get pretty much on all modern platforms. And it's really cool compilation package, where again it has a lot of these old games. And I don't think it'll have like Pac-Man though and all, but it has like stuff like Missile Command, Asteroids, and things like that. And it's what's cool about it is that it gives a lot of like history on it. It has some interviews with a lot of the old developers from back in the day. And yeah, it's a cool way to check it out and get some information on, what was going on in, during this time frame. Because it's interesting, because I mean, these were the pioneers, right, of the video game industry. Like people like, oh God, let's see, Nolan Bushnell, who he was, kind of the founder, I guess you can say, of Atari. And then Chuck E. Cheese, I believe he was the main person behind that. And then just a lot of people that he worked with, and just all the drama that was happening back then and all, it kind of seemed like Atari, from what I've read and seen and just, various documentaries, it kind of seemed like they were very much like a very almost a bit of a rebellious attitude. People, the workers there would be, smoking weed, it sounds like they were drinking maybe in the building and all. And so it almost seemed like a frat house, in the, there. And I think it was just a lot of young people, that with a lot of technology, video games that were coming out at the time, or just the ability to create stuff like this, and the computer culture and all that this is where it sort of first started. And I guess you can say like kind of the geekdom of what we know it now this is where it kind of originated from. And so they were sort of the young guns back in the day. And so, they had their partying and their rebellious attitudes probably at the time and all. And, Atari became hugely successful. And so I think that they were just riding on that success for several years, until eventually something happened in the video game industry, which we'll get that, in a few years here to come. But yeah, I can imagine at the time it was the cool thing to do. And it seemed like it was highly profitable. And it was just sort of the Wild West back then. I mean, this is where video games started, because the first generation was just Pong, basically. It was just multiple variations of Pong. And so there wasn't really a whole lot there, right, that you can, you know, like there's just not all, it's just Pong basically, right? I mean, the consoles, I guess, themselves were, interesting as far as, that the technology started existing, that you can do, plug it to your TV and play a video game. But it was really in the second generation where, the consoles were starting to get a little bit more powerful. They started having interchangeable cartridges, which I believe the Fairchild, I believe, is the name of the console that started doing that. And so now, you were getting more experimentation with what kind of games were being out there. So now they're broadening their horizons. Like, okay, we can do like a maze kind of game, right? And where you're running away from the enemy, or like Pac-Man, or where you're, all these missiles are coming down and you got to shoot them all, like Missile Command, which was inspired by things from like the Cold War and all. So now you were expanding out a little bit more. Or asteroids, where you're shooting a bunch of asteroids in space, or a racing game, like apparently that Rally X game that came out. Things like that, they're getting experimental, and so this is where like genres of video games started being created. And then there was also, I think it said here that the adventure game, did that come out during this year? I think I saw a mention of it here somewhere. Well, if it didn't, but games like Adventure, yeah, oh yeah, it does say here, 1980 Adventure. And so I played a little bit of that game, and it's very simplistic and very basic, right? And you're like a dot basically moving around through a maze, but it started, laying the foundation down of like adventure style games and RPGs and all, things like The Legend of Zelda eventually, where it's not just, a simple basic gameplay loop and all, where you're just trying to chase a high score. And now it's like, using your imagination, that you're now on this adventure, you're in a fantasy land and all that. And, again, back in the day, your mind was filling in a lot of the blanks, but that was just kind of the fun of it back then. And so this is where a lot of it started. So, if for younger generation and all that are really into some of these games, and even, if you can't go back to these games because they are pretty archaic now, at the very least, it's interesting to learn about it, I think, as to just where the seeds were starting to be planted for, what we have nowadays. And so it's just always fun to look back to on all, and a lot of the people, what they were doing back then to, give us the stuff that we have nowadays. But, yep, that's what I got for 1980. Again, some of these some of these more earlier episodes that I'll be doing of these earlier years in gaming might not be quite as long, because again, I don't have a whole lot of experience. I'm just going off of things that I've seen on the internet and my experience with playing some of these games. But yeah, I mean, it was must have been an interesting time back then. Like I said, I still remember going to the arcades as I started getting a bit older and seeing some of these arcades still out there, like, Missile Command, Pac-Man, and a lot of these, and, playing them to some extent, and they were fun. And so I can imagine, back in the day, like if you were a teenager or a little bit older and all, that would have definitely been a fun scene to go to the arcades and, just, have competitions with your friends at that time. So, interesting time. And yeah, it was kind of exciting to see where a lot of this started. But that's what I got for today. And so I will be hopefully back by next Sunday doing the next one, where we'll do another roulette of gaming. If I happen to play a bit of the games that I discussed in that, I'll make mention of them here, see what I got for modern gaming information at that time. And then we'll look at 1981. So, all right. Hope you all have a great week. And until the next.